Welcome to Life, Liberty, and Property, Early Pursuits of Happiness on Rhinebeck's Oak Street. Rarely can such a short trail illuminate such big stories, but that's exactly the case here. The subdivision of 51 lots on Oak Street was created sometime before the 1824 death of the wealthy landowner Brigadier General Martin Hermans. The first recorded sale that we can find is the 1833 sale of a lot by Herman's family member, Clarissa Kipp, to a formerly enslaved black couple, Peter and Lydia Johnson. The 1,000-foot Oak Street was spoken of derisively by outsiders as a less than desirable place to live, and yet it's a shining example of how people of diverse backgrounds came to live in very close proximity. Some houses are 3 feet apart, and through tolerance and the benefit of the security and economic foothold offered by property, advance their personal and family condition and take steps toward the American dream. We'll look at these 3 aspirational groups reflected in the neighborhood before the Civil War. First, recently emancipated or self-emancipated blacks who had legally been defined and bought and sold as property, who worked to move to legal personhood, then citizenship, then a guarantee of equal rights. Next, impoverished Irish Catholic immigrants who came in great numbers with the start of the decade-long 1845 Potato Famine. They were different from earlier Irish immigrants in that they were both impoverished and not Protestant but Catholic. Third, white working-class poor under the banner of mechanics who as trades and craftsmen described themselves as a producing class when compared to the wealthy elite. Within this group grew an anti-immigrant political movement of those born on U.S. soil called the Native American Political Movement, in a use of the word that's very different from its use today. We even get a glimpse into the effect of land dispossession on a woman of the Seminole indigenous peoples of Florida. How did the people of this neighborhood argue for and work toward security in life, liberty, and property in their pursuit of happiness? We'll see actions that range from tolerance to battles at the ballot box to sporadic physical violence and war. We've sometimes heard the word upstairs, downstairs, used to describe the wealthy family who lives upstairs and is tended to by servants who live and work in the basement. Applied here, the upstairs are the homes of the great estates along the river and certain homes along West Market Street, which leads to the river. The downstairs are the small lots in this subdivision along Oak Street that became home to shoemakers, blacksmiths, carriage makers, and tinsmiths. The local historian Howard Morse wrote in 1908 that this area was the beehive of Rhinebeck, given the concentration of active trades and craftsmen and women. The abolition of slavery took place in New York in 1827 and ended in the nation decades later in 1865. The railroad along the Hudson River, built almost exclusively by Irish Catholic immigrants, opened between New York and Poughkeepsie December 31st, 1849, with a stretch that passed Rhinebeck under construction into the 1850s. These 2 dynamics explain why the first black owners of lots on Oak Street occurred in 1833, and the first Irish Catholic owners occurred in 1850. The first white American-born working-class families bought lots on Oak Street in 1863. All 3 groups could be found on Oak Street well into the 20th century. We'll keep an eye out for the physical aspects of property, both in terms of the configuration of the lot and the configuration of the house that's built on that lot. The subdivision had 51 numbered lots, which for the most part were 40 feet wide and at most 200 feet deep. We know from other research of free black communities emerging in Dutchess County before the Civil War that these communities attracted not only recently emancipated enslaved men, women, and children, but freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. As a consequence, there could be a good many very rudimentary homes like this shanty that's shown, most likely in this case with an Irish immigrant woman in front. Even simpler structures that are not much more than a lean-to emerged in what could be either rapidly growing or very transient neighborhoods. We've seen a number of houses built into the side of a hill that reduced the cost of construction but also reduced light and air. These are the types of houses that may have existed but not survived. What does remain in great numbers, however, are two types of houses. The classic story-and-a-half house with its small horizontal windows, which would be typical of what you would find in rural areas of Dutchess County, in homes that were built for tenant farmers. This structure afforded the greatest economy because it allowed for a second floor, but without the greater cost of a full floor. This style of house is known to have been popular in the Hudson Valley and replicated in routes to the American West. The third type of home is the full two-story home, as you see here. This particular house was a commercial operation that took in boarders and acted as a paid almshouse for the poor and homeless that had become the responsibility of the village. The current owner, who restored and renovated the house decades ago, reports that it's evident that when built it was made from other seemingly random pieces of wood and assembled in a way that suggests only the most basic resources were available. One of the reasons property ownership is so important is that from the very first act setting out voting rights in colonial New York in 1691, the right to vote was based on a certain value of property ownership. At that time, it was 40 pounds. This continued until after the Revolution and until a New York State Constitutional Convention in 1821 ended that requirement for white men, but it specifically retained it for black men at a level of $250 free and clear of any mortgage. This prompted some interesting workarounds, including what you see here. In 1846, Gerrit Smith divided 120,000 acres of untouched land that he owned in the Adirondacks into 40-acre plots and began giving them to 3,000 free African Americans living in New York State, so they would qualify to vote. This shows part of the list covering Dutchess County and shows that William Eseltine of Rhinebeck received a parcel. The endeavor, while well-intentioned, was cumbersome and not practical, and was abandoned after a decade. Property ownership was important because neighborhood proximity could provide safety and oversight of the community. In 1831, James Goldman of Poughkeepsie was an 11-year-old black boy when he was lured onto a boat with the promise of oranges. He was kidnapped and taken and sold into slavery in Kentucky. He eventually managed to escape and was able to tell his story 10 years later, as reported through The Colored American in 1841 by J.W. Pennington. Pennington was a black educator and abolitionist leader who for some time lived in Poughkeepsie. In 1832, a young Poughkeepsie boy was taken by stagecoach owner and operator Isaac Butler to Virginia to get and trade horses with the permission of the boy's father. But Butler returned without the boy, saying the boy had run away. Only because of extraordinary luck, the young boy mentioned a few prominent people he was aware of in Poughkeepsie, like Judge Emmett, who was known to the Virginia judge. This led to investigations, which led to the boy's return, and Isaac Butler was charged in Dutchess County Court. Another reason that property ownership, especially when focused on one neighborhood, was important because it could allow for the easier accommodation of freedom seekers who'd not stand out in the way they would elsewhere. For obvious reasons, documentation about the Underground Railroad is very hard to come by. At Rhinebeck Cemetery Section E, a section created in 1853 through a gift of land, specifically allowing for the burial of persons of color who were segregated in death as in life, a great many names of Oak Street residents are found. We find the headstone of Robert St. John's wife, Julia, who died in 1869 and a young son. We're fortunate that a rich trove of church records and two local historians' diaries from the time offer insight into the nearby New Guinea community in Hyde Park, so we know that Robert St. John was enslaved in Brazil, making his way to Canada when he decided the New Guinea community was a safe place to stay. This reflects the concept of safety in numbers. We don't know where Robert St. John is buried, but we know he lived to old age around the Hyde Park, Rhinebeck border, around Statsburg on a farm. Before 1827, you'd see in local newspapers, in this instance in 1822, notices about the 4th of July and the celebration of liberty, at the same time as you'd see notices of local runaway freedom seekers, such as Prince in Armenia, a 20-year-old enslaved black man, or you would see ads for the purchase and sale of enslaved men, women, and children. So an organized, physically close community of color, such as this along Oak Street, would offer privacy, protection, and cover for anyone seeking to liberate themselves. The first known documented purchase of a lot was in 1833 by Peter and Lydia Johnson, who bought lot number 18 for $40. This is the site but not the house from that time. Lydia was 50 years old but had many years ahead of her. She was emancipated from enslavement by Revolutionary War Colonel Henry B. Livingston in 1818, just 15 years prior. The first document shown is an August 1818 notice by Henry B. Livingston that a girl was born of enslaved Lydia and Peter Johnson in 1815. Livingston was 3 years late in reporting what was then required by law, given the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1799, to record all births and manumissions. It seems likely he was getting paperwork in order because the following month in September, we see that he emancipated Lydia and he's testifying that she meets the requirements to be allowed to be free, that she's under 45 and able to take care of herself. The town did not want to gain the liability of an impoverished person, so the overseers of the poor had to testify to her age and condition. Lydia Johnson is shown here in the 1840 census, shown among a cluster of so-called free persons of color who were identified in a separate set of columns that then indicated the person's age. The census was generally taken door to door sequentially, so a cluster of persons like this indicates that they were living close together. This is Oak Street in 1840. Lydia Johnson is shown as over 55, and she's living with 2 children, a boy and a girl, although she had at least 10 children. Lydia's death notice in 1873 mentioned that Rhinebeck had lost one of its oldest inhabitants, reporting, and I quote, "Everyone knew her, everyone was familiar with her. She had a kind word to say to one and all. None hated her, all liked her. She has left a good record. She lived to see her people raised to an equality as regards civil and political rights and privileges," end quote. In his 1908 history, Howard Morse wrote this about her: "Lydia was a bright, happy, hard-working woman until the last. She had a pleasant word for everyone." We also know that a headstone was important to Lydia. In her will, she instructed her son to purchase a stone for her grave, suitable for her position in life, is how she put it. She's buried in Rhinebeck Cemetery, Section E. Lydia's former owner did not have such a positive reputation. Henry Beekman Livingston was living in the historic house no longer standing that's indicated by a historic marker near the river, known as the Kip Livingston Herman's house, reflecting its consecutive ownership. It was a stone house that was the first house in the area. It was destroyed by fire in 1910, but remaining stone was rescued and used under the supervision of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, when Rhinebeck's U.S. Post Office was created in the exact image of the original house, so that its general outline is similar. The Livingstons were among the largest slaveholders, and Henry B. Livingston in 1800 is shown to have owned 13 slaves. It sounds as if Lydia was among them. We may wonder how Henry B. Livingston treated those he enslaved, but we do know how he treated his wife. This is a story worth quickly sharing because of her specific use of the word slave to describe a most undesirable state, reflecting the dawning consciousness of liberty among a wider range of people at the time of the recently born United States. Of course, women did not gain the right to vote nationally until 1919, but it sounds as if the former Mrs. Livingston would have been at the front of the women's suffrage movement if she had lived a few generations later. Anne Shippen Livingston took the unusual move to sue for divorce quickly after her marriage to Livingston and the birth of their child. In an interesting choice of words, she writes about marriage this way: "I cannot agree that women are only born to suffer and obey. Equality is the soul of friendship. Marriage, to give delight, must join 2 minds, and not just devote a slave to the will of an imperious lord." End quote. Lydia Johnson would have been 6 years old at the time of Livingston's marriage and divorce, assuming she was with Livingston then. Lydia and Peter Johnson are reported to have had many children. Among the better known was their son, William Johnson. Earlier in life, William had been a chauffeur, a traditional role for men of color at the time, but he found great success in becoming a chef and restaurant owner. Research by Bruce Dedrick shows that Johnson ran a refreshment saloon at the Poughkeepsie train station during the Civil War. In 1866, he opened a barber shop in Rhinebeck for a short time. He really hit his stride with the opening of what newspapers at the time said was, quote, a first-class restaurant in every respect. It was 2 doors south of Starr Institute, which would be the site of today's Foster's, in a building that is no longer standing. He was known for his root beer on ice, for fine oysters and clams. He opened an ice cream and confectionery store in Rhinecliff that was highly regarded. Johnson's wife arranged for the import of oranges from Florida. In 1895, he moved his fish, vegetable, and ice cream business to Oak Street, presumably his home. He operated a catering business for the Hudson River steamboats. He was for a time chef at what is today the Beekman Arms. He died at his home on Oak Street, January 29, 1913, around the age of 100. His story is particularly inspiring when we consider his parents started out life being defined as property themselves and without rights. In 1835, lot number 22 was purchased by Sally Gilson and her mother, Betty Schermerhorn. We know a good deal about Sally Gilson because of her long tenure enslaved at Janet Livingston Montgomery's house, known as Montgomery Place in Red Hook. Her tenure lasted beyond the life of Janet Livingston, who died in 1827, and lasted into subsequent members of the family who lived there. Gilson was provided for in Janet Livingston's will and was father to another landowner close by on adjacent West Chestnut Street. She's buried in the Red Hook Methodist Cemetery with her son and daughter, neither of whom married. The headstone is shown here. Her son, Alexander Gilson, was head gardener at Montgomery Place. He's internationally recognized as a botanist for having created a type of begonia that's double blossoming. The official name of the plant is named for him, Begonia gilsoni. He owned property in Red Hook as well as Rhinebeck. The property associated him while adjacent to Oak Street on West Chestnut is part of the 51-lot subdivision. Also in 1835, Sally Lawson Butler bought 3 adjacent lots that remain combined today, making it the widest lot on Oak Street. She purchased lots number 39, 40, and 41. She's buried at Rhinebeck Section E under a headstone that reads Sally L., wife of James Butler. Her children lived in the house after her death. Sales appear quiet until 1845, when Theodore and Margaret Thomas purchased lot number 19. Census records show that Theodore was born in Maryland, and it seems highly likely he would have been enslaved. The headstone of the son, George Washington Thomas, who died when he was 18 in 1861, is in Rhinebeck Cemetery Section E. The Thomases were involved in selling a portion of the land that would become the Oak Street Schoolhouse in 1844. The schoolhouse that stands today on Oak Street is distinct from its neighbors for several reasons. One is that it has a very large setback. The other is its unmistakable board and batten Gothic Revival architecture style. Built in 1844 under the direction of school trustees, the schoolhouse was sold sometime after 1868 to private individuals. In 1870, it was being used as a blacksmith shop. Crummy may have lived across the street with the Lyden family, Irish immigrants who we will meet shortly. This map showing Oak Street prior to 1850 shows landowners of African descent in orange and the school outlined in gray. In 1850, records indicate that the first purchase of land on Oak Street by Irish immigrants was made. The first such lots are shown in green, as is a third lot that was bought shortly thereafter. The Irish-born Daniel Garvey may have been some sort of intermediary with railroad workers, because his name shows up not only in the purchase of the 2 adjacent lots in 1850, but subsequently with a few other purchases and sales on the street. Garvey bought Lot 23 and Lot 24, which are shown here. We know that a good many Irish railroad workers lived in the most rudimentary of housing, called shanties, along the railroad tracks. It's no surprise, then, that the first Catholic church in Rhinebeck, St. Joseph, shown here in an older and a contemporary photo, emerged in Rhinecliff. A carpenter himself, St. Joseph is the patron saint of the working class and immigrants. Persons of color continued to purchase lots and land. In 1854, lots 44 and 45 were bought by Dennis Savoy, located at the extreme northeast part of Oak Street, north of the intersection with West Chestnut Street. The original house that was the Savoys, we believe, does not stand today. The story of the Savoys is amazing for several reasons. It illuminates the classic role, in this case, of young men of African descent being waiters, and it illuminates the charged and dangerous dynamics of the deadly competitive steamboat business on the Hudson. Each boat was determined to show that it was the fastest. This unusual and extraordinary headstone is in Rhinebeck Section E, where 4 Savoy sons are buried. 3 died at the same time in 1854. They were all on board the steamboat Reindeer when it exploded. They are buried with a son who had died several years earlier. They were serving as waiters on the boat. In 1855, Henry Williams bought Lot 35. His wife Hannah's headstone is visible at the Rhinebeck Cemetery, Section E. Census records suggest they had 7 children and that Henry Williams was a coachman. Thomas Lyden and wife Bridget emigrated from Galway, Ireland to the United States in 1849. In 1854, they bought Lot 31, and in 1856 bought the south half of adjoining Lot 32, giving them 60 feet of Oak Street frontage that remains the lot size today. Here they raised 6 children, including 3 sons who volunteered to serve in the Civil War. Martin was born in Ireland in 1846. He enlisted in the 150th New York Volunteers and was killed in action July 13, 1864, outside of Atlanta, Georgia, where he is buried in a military cemetery. Patrick was born in Ireland in 1840. He enlisted in the 128th New York Volunteers. He died in 1894 in Lincoln, Kansas, after inheriting his brother's ranch, who we'll talk about next. John Lyden was born in Ireland in 1841. He enlisted in the 6th New York Cavalry and was involved in battles in the U.S. West in the unfortunate displacement of indigenous people. He fought in important Indian wars in the Great Plains, including the battle that involved the death of Chief Roman Nose. In this instance, it's property in Kansas that provided the stepping stone. John Lyden managed to turn land grants he earned through war service into land that allowed him to become a wealthy cattle rancher. His wealth was attractive to criminals, and John was murdered on his ranch in Kansas in 1875 to conceal the theft of his extensive cattle herd. As mentioned earlier, his older Patrick took over the ranch. June 1st, 1875 is a landmark date because it marks the day that Hugh and Ann Maher bought lots 29 and 30. The 1906 obituary in the Rhinebeck Gazette described Hugh Maher as having come from Ireland to Rhinebeck in 1856. Active with St. Joseph's in Rhinebeck, he was one of the founders of the Church of the Good Shepherd in the village of Rhinebeck. But Anne, in particular, became quite well known and visible as a community leader. While she did not hold political office, she seems to have been a prominent community leader for an area that was frequently looked down upon. She ran a hotel and tavern on Oak Street and was occasionally reimbursed for taking care of impoverished homeless persons. The Red Hook Journal in June of 1894 commented on her death, describing her as eccentric, but leaving a good deal of property and savings. A quick aside on the role of property in the very long path of women fighting for the right to vote, mentioned earlier. We lack a specific example tied to Rhinebeck, but have many examples in adjacent towns. Going back to 1776 and the founding call for independence, that there can be no taxation without representation. This was among the arguments women made for the right to vote, that they owned property and paid taxes, but had no right to vote. A small but important victory came in New York in 1880, when women were allowed to vote in school elections only and become candidates. A review of the first women to step forward as candidates in the county shows that over half were daughters of Irish immigrants. The first woman in the county to be elected to office was Nancy Boyd Duncan, the daughter of Irish immigrants in Unionvale. The reputation of the Irish dominating police and fire roles, being a fireman used to be an acceptable alternative to a requirement for white men to vote if they did not own property. And getting involved in politics is found as a rich story locally in the county. We cannot gloss over the fact that the Irish immigrants found a very difficult and sometimes hostile environment that they hoped to reverse through economic prosperity, including property, and through political gains. The scale of Irish immigration was unprecedented, as was their non-Protestant faith. In 1823, local newspapers reported that of the total of 2,282 immigrants to the United States in a 2-week period, 581 came from Ireland. The 1845 Potato Famine, especially affecting poorer populations, combined with demand for railroad workers, accelerated Catholic Irish immigration. By the 1840s, we find the use of the word Native American used in a very different way than we do today. At that time, Native American was referring to those born within the borders of the United States. The 1840s saw a newspaper evolve called The American, published out of Poughkeepsie, to accommodate those with anti-immigrant political views. Every week, they reported the ship log, ship by ship, noting the number of immigrants with a clear warning. They reported, and I quote, "The whole number arrived since the 1st of March last year is 124,847. At this rate, how long will it be before the American mechanic and laborer, who at present receive wages barely sufficient to provide the common necessities of life, how long can it be before they are reduced to the starving millions of Europe?" End quote. In October of 1846, you can see a notice of a Native American political party meeting in Rhinebeck. The word mechanic is used for decades to refer to a full or wide range of working class people. We can't gloss over the fact that the pressure to find economic opportunity and social acceptance pitted blacks and Irish immigrants against each other. The most dramatic example of this were the draft riots during the Civil War. Although we have no evidence of anything happening locally in Rhinebeck, the dramatic events in New York City were breathtaking. Ironically, it was July of 1863 when J.W. Pennington, the black leader referenced earlier, was leading a statewide conference in Poughkeepsie, assembling signed documents to take to President Lincoln to lobby the federal government to lift its prohibition of arming black men in service to the United States. He had a list of 10,000 black men's names who wanted to fight but were prohibited because of their race. This is ironic because there was a need for soldiers, and many Irish felt that they were being drafted, forced to fight for a cause that was not their concern. Frustrated by the fact that they felt they were being compelled to fight and potentially die in a war that had nothing to do with them, groups of largely Irish wreaked havoc on black homes, churches, and the colored orphan asylum in New York City. In an open letter, Pennington asks why the Irish would do this. He would have known the answer hinted at earlier, that demand for a limited amount of work, demand for social equality, fairness, and justice were creating tensions. This is what makes the voluntary enlistment of the 3 Lyden young men so interesting by contrast. The Irish themselves were victims of riots, such as those fought against them in Philadelphia. This is a difficult story, but it reveals a closeness between the black and Irish immigrant community on Oak Street that's important to understand, especially in the context of stories of these conflicts. And it is a sentiment that can be otherwise hard to measure. A young black boy on Oak Street and a young boy with parents who were Irish immigrants were playing together. The black boy caused the accidental death of the young Irish American boy. The parents of the boy killed went out of their way to say that the accident was just that, and there should be no responsibility or blame. The mother is quoted as saying, The children had been fast friends and played with each other every day. There were white American-born working-class so-called mechanics on Oak Street. The O'Haras, for example. In 1863, three brothers, Stephen, William, and Alvin O'Hara, bought the Savoy lots. The 1865 census shows that Stephen, age 32, was a clerk, William was 27 and a tinsmith, and Alvin, age 24, was a shoemaker. Luther, their father, was a hat maker, born in New Jersey, and they had a boarder who was a shoemaker. They received a grocery license and a license to sell intoxicating liquors. We can see in this newspaper clipping from 1873 that the O'Haras received payments of $27.04 from the village for housing poor and homeless persons. You can see that Ann Maher received $78.64 for the same service. Towns and villages had elected overseers of the poor who made determinations as to whether someone would qualify, and if they did qualify, where they would be housed. In 1865, the children of Sally Lawson Butler, who first purchased the three adjacent lots, and we believe built this house, sold the premises to Michael and Frances Schwartz. The house stayed in the family for 87 years until the buyer's son, John Schwartz, who was an electrician, died in the house in 1952. The house was only owned by two families between 1835 and 1952. 27 Oak Street also stayed in one family for a long time. Albert Wager was a shoemaker. In 1933, his granddaughter, who was living in the house at the time, found a boot they had made in 1863. Through marriage, the house was lived in by the Lyden family when in 1944, U.S. Army Sergeant David Lyden was killed in action in France. There's a strong record of service to the United States on Oak Street. I'd like to look at the upstairs portion of the neighborhood because of the intersections with Oak Street, both literally and figuratively. We'll find stories about property and a determination to move from poverty. Also, it will allow us to examine the reference made earlier to the young woman of the Seminole in Florida who came to live on Oak Street. We examined Colonel Henry B. Livingston, who at one time had owned Peter and Lydia Johnson, who were the first known black purchasers of land on Oak Street. Nathan Darling built his house a decade before he died. It was the capstone of a life of ambition. We believe that prior to building his house in 1858, his house was much simpler. This map, published in 1858, shows two houses. We believe the house in front toward the road was the simpler house, and this more elaborate house was under construction or new. Current owners of the house have found the foundation of the earlier house in the front lawn. Nathan Darling's sister, Catherine, managed to emerge from poverty and worked as a bookbinder in New York City. But his brother, William Darling, never escaped impoverishment and was a lifelong embarrassment to Nathan Darling. Nathan Darling's second wife, whom he married much later in life and who was from New York City, testified that she did not know who Nathan Darling's parents were and that he did not talk about his parents. After marrying a local woman named Margaret Ackert, a solid and numerous family in Rhinebeck, the couple moved to New York City, where he was a house painter. He's found to have very quickly gotten involved in local politics, in the mechanics movement, the political movement of the working class, a group that published this list of its members showing carpenters, stainers, and chairmakers. Perhaps this is a good place to mention Darling's children, which also shows that while born into poverty, Nathan Darling had certain intersections with wealthy and influential people, whose origins are not necessarily clear to us. In the 1820s, 2 children died in infancy. A decade later, 2 children survived longer but not past young adulthood. The one to live the longest was Christopher Kierstead Darling, who grew old enough to start to work as a policeman in New York City. Christopher Kierstead Darling was the name of the infant who died a decade earlier. Christopher Kierstead was a well-known and wealthy doctor. The Kierstead House still stands, It's exactly between the house of Nathan Darling and Ambrose Wager, who we'll touch on shortly. We don't know the origin of the relationship of the families, but the naming of two sons shows some important connection. Perhaps Nathan Darling's marriage to Margaret Ackert gave him some advantage. This is a letter published in the Dutchess Observer singing the praises of the mechanic. It says, and I quote, "In the history of distinguished men of all ages, there will be found a larger number of the lives of those who emanated from the humble situation of mechanics than from any other existing professions. Mechanics are frequently the children of poverty, their early days often of sorrow and toil. When they arrive at manhood, they're determined to emerge from the pit of obscurity where fate had placed them," end quote. The story of being born in poverty but driven to succeed is the story of Nathan Darling. As we saw earlier, though, in the American newspaper, the story of these mechanics are the stories of American-born mechanics with American virtues and values, as they saw them. The open letter refers to the printer Benjamin Franklin as the perfect example of a simple printer of humble beginnings who, through careful and diligent work, rose to prominence and wealth and influence. This image of Franklin is from the murals of the Poughkeepsie Journal building in Poughkeepsie. The mechanics movement was not restricted to New York City. As early as 1810, you can see a subdivision of lots on what is today East Market Street, described as lots suitable for mechanics in advertisements. This 1844 local newspaper report of a Dutchess County mechanics meeting in the town of Clinton uses language to point out how many of the working class are unable to own land, reporting that Dutchess County has, and I quote, 7,000 landless slaves, end quote. That's an interesting choice of words. Darling's continued involvement and leadership in the mechanics political movement in Rhinebeck can be seen in an 1849 story. The Gazette of the Union is a publication of the Oddfellows, a temperance group that Darling was very involved with. In March of 1849, they reported on a celebration of Washington's birthday, a very important holiday at the time, that took place at Rhinebeck's Dutch Reformed Church, the one that stands today. They describe a very colorful and animated event. The Gazette reports that, quote, "the Sons of Temperance, the United American Mechanics and Cadets of Temperance, participated in full regalia," end quote. They explain that the groups assembled outside the council room of the Mechanics Association, and they marched in procession to the church with Captain Nathan Darling in the lead. It seems, as you'll see later, Nathan Darling liked a parade. They entered the church at 7 p.m. and occupied the central pews. The galleries were occupied by the ladies. The report, and I quote, says the following: "A staging had been erected in front of the pulpit. The splendid banner of the Oddfellows was displayed over the pulpit, the banner of the Sons of Temperance on the east, the flag of the Mechanics on the west, the banner of the Washingtonians and others were displayed in the galleries." In the following year, in 1850, we find an example of Nathan Darling's later-in-life involvement in the state militia. A year after the mechanics gathering, we find he and his son involved in quelling a riot of rival Irish immigrant groups at Rhinecliff at the railroad. The tension was between two rival Irish Catholic groups, the Connaughts and Fardowners. As pressure mounted for limited jobs, even old rivalries from Ireland generations prior could rear their head in this way. These reports show reimbursement costs for Nathan Darling, his son Christopher Kiersted Darling, and many others who were called upon to function as police. It was reported that several rioters were killed and hundreds were taken and imprisoned at the center of the village. While the mechanics movement was Darling's political philosophy, that was merely a step toward gaining political appointments, which could lead to property and wealth. Among his political appointments was in 1833, when he was appointed to the U.S. Customs House in New York City, today the site of Federal Hall on Wall Street. This map shows some of the forts, trails, and battles of the Seminole Wars in Florida involving the displacement of indigenous peoples, where Darling built his military career, with 3 consecutive 2-year presidential appointments where he served as captain with the 2nd Dragoons. His land bounties included land in Louisiana that included enslaved men, women, and children. Darling's first appointment came from President Andrew Jackson, the breakthrough common man and military hero who was the first U.S. president to not have a refined pedigree. Jackson was responsible for the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Darling's second appointment came from U.S. President Martin Van Buren, the Columbia County politician known as the Little Magician, given his skilled political maneuvering. Could there have been a special relationship between Darling and Van Buren? In extraordinary testimony in a court case relating to his brother, after both the brother and Nathan Darling were dead, Nathan Darling's wife is challenged with a shocking question. Do you know that it was a common report that Nathan Darling was a son of Martin Van Buren? Objection, yelled the opposing attorney, which the judge sustained and her answer was suppressed. In 1908, the historian Howard Morse refers to Darling as a, quote, protege of Van Buren, which with this additional knowledge makes us wonder, is this one of the sources of Darling's advantage? It seems unlikely to me, but nevertheless appears to have been a prominent rumor at the time. Darling's third appointment to the military came from President Tyler. This is a sketch in a diary of someone who served in Nathan Darling's 2nd Dragoons, and you'll find they're deeply engaged in trying to understand the indigenous people as a way to engage and manipulate to get their ultimate goal of dispossession. The soldiers keeping track of language translation, sketching how indigenous people looked, keeping track of vegetation, and recording events such as dinners where Darling was present. Again, going to Morse's history, it's interesting that Darling is reported to have had indigenous people as servants. Morse writes he had 1 or 2 Indian servants. And if we look at the 1850 census, we see that in the Nathan Darling household, there was a young woman named Louisa, age 16, who was born in Florida, whose race is identified with an M, which would have meant mulatto, which was used at the time to identify Indians and identify mixed-race persons. It seems fair to assume that this woman came back with Nathan Darling from the wars. If we look at the 1860 census, there is a woman from Florida, exactly 10 years older, whose name is indicated with the initial L, living on Oak Street, married to a black man. If we look at the man, George Johnson, probably a son of Lydia and Peter Johnson. If we look at the man, George Johnson, a decade later, still on Oak Street, his wife's name is listed as wife. The age does not quite match. The wife's birthplace is listed as Ulster County. It's not clear what's happening here, but is perhaps emblematic of the challenge of identity of indigenous people at the time. Regarding local indigenous peoples, which is very relevant in a story about the right to enjoyment of and benefit from property, we show a recent photograph of a petroglyph in Rhinebeck at the Wilderstein estate, and on the right, an earlier drawing trying to capture the original full image. It's believed that it was drawn by indigenous persons to some way mark land that was being sold to European settlers. In this period, European settlers who sought the grant of a patent, so they had legal right to the land, required the applicant to prove that they had purchased the land from indigenous peoples. But different concepts of what land ownership meant among native peoples, a lack of clarity of who among native peoples had what authority over what scope of land, vague and sometimes intentionally erroneous surveys and naming conventions for landmarks that allowed for misinterpretation left many questions about the legality of land claims. At the time of early Dutch and English settlement in the early 17th century, looking broadly at the Northeast, what we today call Rhinebeck was a border area with the Mohican to the north, the Schaghticoke to the east, and Wappinger and Lenape to the south. The southern tip of the U-shaped Roloff-Jansen Hill became the southernmost point in the land of the Livingston Manor in Columbia County. The hand-shaped Wappinger Creek is the area around which Dutchess County is organized. And the dominant river of eastern Dutchess County, the 10-Mile River, flows to Long Island Sound, reflecting that area's continuing bridging of New England and New York. By the middle of the 19th century, through disease and through active displacement, the local indigenous population had declined, but despite popular mythologies like James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, did not disappear, and descendants live locally today Many were dispersed to Wisconsin, who remained connected to the area through the Stockbridge-Muncie community. After serving through presidential appointments from the 1830s to 1840s in military roles, Darling's ready-to-rumble, dynamic personality continued into his civilian work with high-profile political maneuvering in Washington, D.C. politics, all the time staying active in Rhinebeck. In 1856, he was elected by Congress to the position of doorkeeper of the U.S. House of Representatives, a visible and influential role that allowed him to make important appointments. This was about the time he was planning and building the house on West Market Street we see today. In 1861, he was appointed chief of Capitol Police, and with an expansive view of his mandate was known to chase secessionist rebels during the Civil War into the southern states. Evidence of his ready-to-rumble personality is evident in a few high-profile cases. Perhaps the most dramatic of his stories happened early in his assignment as doorkeeper, when in May of 1856, he tended to the wounded U.S. Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. Sumner was an outspoken abolitionist U.S. Senator from Massachusetts who was brutally beaten about the head and body with a cane by a pro-slavery Southern congressman. Darling reported, "I've dressed wounds and could amputate a leg if necessary. When I arrived there, I found Mr. Sumner all covered with blood. The bystanders did not seem to understand much about it or seemed frightened, and I went to work. I examined his head," and then he goes on to describe in a way that's tough to read, in very graphic detail, all the wounds that the senator suffered. In 1860, Darling was accused of resisting and interfering with federal marshals in the execution of their duty to capture a black man named Stafford, who was a self-emancipated freedom seeker. It was a legal test because it was the first test of the fugitive slave law in Washington, D.C., a law which penalized persons for doing anything other than aiding the return of the so-called property to its owner. Darling was acquitted, but it's hard to imagine he did not have some role in standing up to federal marshals when we consider his political views at the time. In 1862, Darling seems to have been too aggressive in preventing a gentleman from Pennsylvania from entering the Capitol on Washington's birthday during celebrations. The aggrieved individual won a lawsuit against Darling, and Darling was fined $40. None other than President Lincoln wrote out a pardon for Darling, saying Darling thought he was just carrying out his duties. In 1850, we find Nathan Darling leading the charge to quell a riot between rival Irish Catholic groups at Rhinecliff, who were vying for work on the railroad. These reports show reimbursement of costs for Nathan Darling and his son, Christopher Kierstead Darling, who were called upon to function as police. As pressure mounted for limited jobs, even old rivalries from Ireland, generations prior, could rear their head in this way. We will conclude with the election and death of Abraham Lincoln, which gives us the opportunity to show a dramatic split between Nathan Darling and his neighbor Ambrose Wager, two men of the white Protestant establishment on opposite sides of the slavery question and presidential election in 1860. It gives us the opportunity to see a local gesture by Lincoln at how to deal with those with different views. Nathan Darling was clearly on the side of Lincoln. The local newspaper reported in 1860, and we quote, "Grand wide-awake demonstration in Rhinebeck, 1,300 men in line. The Republicans of Rhinebeck had a grand time last Friday evening. The parade of the wide-awakes was far ahead of any political procession ever seen before in this town. The clubs from Poughkeepsie were on hand, headed by the Flockton Cornet Band, and were honored with the right of the line. The procession formed in the following order under command of Captain Darling, Grand Marshal. Almost every house in the village was illuminated, and the enthusiasm of the spectators was unbounded as a political demonstration. It was most successful and showed most conclusively that the Rhinebeck Republicans are wide awake for the cause." The wide awakes were obviously the most aggressive and outspoken supporters of Lincoln, and this report is from a Republican-oriented newspaper. On the Republican side, with Lincoln at the top of the ticket, Nathan Darling was a visible leader. Ambrose Wager was clearly on the side of the opposing party. The opposition party candidates were Stephen A. Douglas for president, and another Rhinebeck resident, William Kelly, was running for governor. He lived on the beautiful and vast Ellerslie estate on the Hudson River, and Ambrose Wager was running for Congress. All the Democrats lost. In 1860, Ambrose Wager was living on Montgomery Street in a house that stands today. It has an unusual octagonal footprint that was fashionable for allowing more light and air for a time in the 1840s. If we want to understand Ambrose Wager's personality, then we learn more by looking at the house built in 1874, right at the intersection with Oak Street on land that he had had for some time. It's interesting to see Wager's political opponents, the mechanics, portraying him as aristocratic. You can certainly get that feeling in the house he built in 1874 as a capstone to his life. He died the following decade. Like bookends to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln stopped in Rhinebeck in February of 1861 on the train from his home in Springfield, Illinois to Washington, and the train passed through Rhinebeck, carrying the remains of the assassinated president back to Illinois in April of 1865. On the train ride, taking him from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, Lincoln stopped briefly at Rhinebeck. According to the front page of the New York Times, he picked up William Kelly, who we mentioned earlier had run for governor of New York and lost. In 1841, William Kelly bought the Ellerslie estate in Rhinebeck. It came to be as famous for its landscape gardens as for its mansion, totaling 800 acres. William Kelly's wealth came from his father, Bob Kelly, a wealthy Irish immigrant of the earlier Protestant kind. It's interesting, given our discussion here of identity, collaboration, and conflict, that William Kelly's father, Bob Kelly, had to flee Ireland in the late 1700s because he was part of a group of Protestants who banded together with Catholics in agreement that the British should be pushed off and out of Ireland. Here, Catholics and Protestants banded together as common residents of the Emerald Isle, with common antipathy for British domination. The effort quickly failed, resulting in Kelly fleeing to the United States, where he built an economic empire in the linen trade. I don't know what Lincoln and Kelly talked about, but it's telling that Lincoln would do such a thing, and do it so publicly. His act of reaching out to an opponent was consistent with his public reputation, a reputation captured by the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin in her book Team of Rivals. The next time Lincoln would be passing through Rhinebeck was during the tragic period after his assassination. On the Wednesday, after his Saturday death, there was a public gathering in Rhinebeck, which was addressed by the pastor of the Dutch Reformed Church, the Reverend Timlow. He spoke in a way that was so moving, we're lucky he was asked to publish his remarks, which are referenced here. Timlow spoke about a union service where neither political party or faith divided or distracted. Was Nathan Darling in the audience? Ambrose Wager? William Kelly? Perhaps Anne Mahar or Aunt Lydia? Were differences put aside in common mourning of the slain president? In a sign of the changing times, in 1866, the Reverend Aaron Olmsted arrived in Rhinebeck as a pastor of the Church of the Messiah. Although born in Connecticut and educated in New York, he was serving in North Carolina when war broke out, and he served there through the end of the war. When he and his family moved north, they invited a woman, Mildred Moore, to join them. Moore was a black woman who'd been enslaved by another family all her life. She was freed upon Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. The Olmsteds, knowing of her for some time, had grown fond of her, and she was fond of the family. Moore would have been 55 years old when she arrived in Rhinebeck, having lived in freedom for only 3 years. In the parsonage, a building that stands on Montgomery Street, right across the street from Ambrose Wager's earlier house. She lived with the family from their arrival in 1866 until her death in 1891. There was standing room only at her funeral at the Church of the Messiah. She was lauded for her character and engagement in the welfare of children. There's nothing particularly exceptional in the story so far. The important difference was and is that she was not buried in Section E, as was the case with so many we've met. Although there are records of black burials in Dutchess County in segregated burial grounds lasting into the 20th century, here Mildred Solomon was laid to rest in the Olmsted family plot in the main section in 1891. It is possible, if not likely, that this is the first such instance. Her headstone, similar to other members of the family, shares the location of her birth and death, and in this case, her long relationship with the family. Here we find Mildred Moore without distinction or reference to race or color. We close a discussion about life, liberty, and property in the pursuit of happiness with a story about a breakthrough in death. Here, a woman of color was no longer limited to the smaller or congested bounds of Rhinebeck Cemetery Section E to define her in memory. The design of Section E, like the design of Oak Street, is the most efficient alignment and repetition of the smallest lots. But these bounds were made to be broken, and so they were. Life, liberty, and property, early pursuits of happiness on Rhinebeck's Oak Street. Stories of personal liberty and ambition bump up against the personal liberty and ambition of others, like Lincoln's favorite story about the shepherd who prevents the wolf from attacking the sheep. The sheep applauds the act for the preservation of its liberty. The wolf decries the act for its denial of its liberty. Disagreement seems inevitable, but how we come to disagree and resolve or accommodate those disagreements is a rich and varied path, with choices even along a 1,000-foot stretch in a neighborhood in Rhinebeck.